before there were cities, before there were names for places, before memory learned how to hold itself in words, there was time, vast time, time that moved without witnesses, time that passed without clocks, calendars, or records. This story begins there, in that long, quiet stretch before civilization, when the world existed without knowing it would someday be remembered. For most of human existence, nothing was written down. No marks were carved into stone to explain who lived, who ruled, or what mattered. There were no chronicles, no laws, no dates to anchor events in neat order. And yet life continued, steadily and patiently, across landscapes shaped by ice, wind, and sun. Generations were born, lived, and disappeared without leaving names behind. Their lives were real, complete, and deeply human, even if history never learned how to speak them aloud. This is what we call prehistory, not because nothing happened, but because nothing was recorded. Prehistory is not a short prologue to civilization. It is the longest chapter of human existence. It stretches back not thousands of years, but millions. It contains nearly everything that made us human before we ever learned how to write it down. In this quiet timeline, change comes slowly, so slowly that no single lifetime could ever notice it. Stone tools shift shape across tens of thousands of years. Bodies adapt over millennia. Entire continents change climate while human beings continue their daily routines, unaware that anything significant is happening at all. There are no sudden beginnings here. No sharp lines between before and after. Only gradual movement, like the turning of the earth itself. Long before humans existed, the planet was already old. Oceans had formed and vanished. Mountains had risen and worn themselves down. Life had appeared in simple forms and patiently experimented with new shapes over unimaginable spans of time. By the time the first human ancestors stood upright beneath an African sky, the earth had already practiced being alive for billions of years. Those early ancestors did not know they were ancestors. They did not see themselves as the start of anything important. They were simply living, walking, eating, resting, avoiding danger, caring for their young. Their concerns were immediate and practical: food, shelter, warmth, safety, the same concerns that would guide human life for most of its existence. Prehistory is often imagined as harsh and dramatic, filled with constant struggle. And while survival was never guaranteed, much of prehistoric life was quiet, repetitive, rhythmic. Days followed nights. Seasons returned as they always had. Camps were made and left behind. Fires were lit, watched, and allowed to fade into ash. These routines created a sense of continuity long before anyone thought to preserve it. There were no borders in the modern sense, no nations, no flags. Human groups moved slowly across land, guided by water, animals, and the memory of paths walked before. Migration was not a single event, but a patient drifting across generations. Children grew up where their grandparents had once arrived as strangers. Over time, the world became familiar through footsteps rather than maps. Language, when it emerged, did not begin as writing. It lived only in sound, in shared understanding, in gestures and glances and repeated stories told by firelight. When those voices fell silent, nothing remained to capture them. And yet those early words shaped relationships, taught survival, and carried meaning long before symbols ever touched clay or stone. Art appeared without audiences. Images were painted deep inside caves where few would ever see them. They were not meant to impress crowds or document events. They were expressions of thought, belief, memory, and perhaps comfort. They remind us that even in deep prehistory, human minds were already rich with imagination and emotion. For hundreds of thousands of years, human beings lived without agriculture, without permanent homes, without ownership as we understand it today. Food was gathered, shared, and consumed. Tools were made, used, and eventually discarded. Life was not simple, but it was balanced in a way that depended entirely on the natural world. When climates shifted, people adapted or moved. When animals migrated, humans followed. The idea of progress does not fit easily here. There was no sense of moving toward a goal called civilization. There was only continuity. Survival passed quietly from one generation to the next. Knowledge was carried in hands and habits rather than books. Wisdom lived in repetition, not innovation. And then, very slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to change. Toward the end of prehistory, some groups began to stay in one place a little longer. Wild plants were tended. Animals were watched more closely. Settlements became semi-permanent, then permanent. Writing would eventually appear, and with it, recorded history. But that moment, when it finally arrived, rested on millions of years of unrecorded human experience. This timeline does not rush toward that ending. It does not treat civilization as the only destination that matters. Instead, it moves patiently through the deep past, honoring the long stretches of time when humanity existed without monuments, without empires, and without written memory. These ages were not empty. They were full of lives lived quietly and completely. As you listen, there is no need to remember dates or names. Let the sense of time itself do the work. Let the slow movement of generations, climates, and landscapes unfold without urgency. This is not a story meant to be hurried. It is meant to be heard the way time itself passes, steadily and without demand. If these calm histories help you rest, you may wish to subscribe to Archive of Rest, where the distant past is told gently and time is allowed to slow down. Now, as we begin, imagine a world without roads, without borders, without written memory. A world guided only by earth, sky, and the quiet persistence of life. This is the world before civilization. And this is where our story truly begins. Long before the first human breath was drawn, before footsteps pressed into soil or hands shaped stone, the earth already carried a history so vast that it cannot be fully held in the mind. This history was not written in language or preserved in memory. It was written in pressure, heat, motion, and time. Time stretching so far back that numbers lose their meaning and only patience remains. To speak of the earth before humans is to slow down completely, to let millions of years pass without urgency, to allow change to happen so gradually that it feels almost still. This world did not rush toward the future. It unfolded quietly, layer by layer, long before anyone existed to notice. The Earth formed approximately 4.5 billion years ago, emerging from a swirling disk of dust and gas surrounding a young sun. Gravity gathered scattered particles together, slowly drawing them inward. As the growing planet accumulated mass, pressure increased. Heat followed. The early Earth was a glowing sphere, its surface molten and unstable, its interior churning endlessly. There was no solid ground at first, no horizon, no sky in the way we understand it today. The surface was dominated by oceans of magma, constantly reshaped by impacts from asteroids and debris left over from the formation of the solar system. These collisions were frequent, powerful, and indifferent. Each one altered the planet slightly, adding material, releasing energy, and changing its surface again and again. Above this restless surface, the early atmosphere formed. It was thick and heavy, filled with gases released from volcanic activity. Carbon dioxide, methane, ammonia, and steam dominated the air. Oxygen, the gas that would later become essential for complex life, was nearly absent. The sky would not have appeared blue. It would have been hazy, dense, and unfamiliar. As time passed, the planet began to cool. Cooling did not happen evenly or quickly. It took hundreds of millions of years for the surface to harden enough to form a stable crust. Even then, that crust fractured repeatedly, breaking apart under the planet's internal heat. Plates formed, shifted, collided, and separated, beginning a process that continues even now. Water vapor in the atmosphere slowly condensed as temperatures dropped. Rain fell, not for days or weeks, but for centuries, millennia, and far longer still. The rain had no memory and no intention. It simply fell, filling in low places in the crust. Slowly, oceans formed. These vast bodies of water covered much of the planet, absorbing heat and moderating temperature. The oceans became the planet's great stabilizers. They reflected sunlight, redistributed warmth, and shaped the land through erosion. Waves wore down rock. Currents moved nutrients across enormous distances. Beneath the surface, chemical reactions unfolded with steady persistence, setting the stage for something new. For a long time, the oceans were lifeless in any way we would recognize. They moved endlessly beneath the sun, empty of creatures yet full of potential. The chemistry of water, energy from sunlight, and the abundance of elements created conditions that allowed complexity to emerge. At some point, life began. Not suddenly, not dramatically. There was no moment that announced its arrival. Instead, simple molecules formed more complex arrangements. These arrangements became self-sustaining. They replicated. They responded to their environment. The earliest life was microscopic, single-celled, and fragile. Yet it endured. These early organisms lived entirely in water. They drifted. They divided. They lived and died without awareness. Over immense spans of time, they multiplied and spread. Some learned to capture energy from sunlight through photosynthesis. In doing so, they released oxygen as a byproduct. At first, oxygen altered the planet violently. It reacted with metals. It transformed the chemistry of the oceans and atmosphere. For many early organisms, oxygen was deadly. Entire forms of life disappeared as oxygen levels slowly rose. But the planet adjusted. New organisms adapted to the changing environment. Over time, oxygen accumulated in the atmosphere. The sky changed. A protective ozone layer formed high above the surface, shielding the planet from harmful solar radiation. This invisible barrier would later make life on land possible, though that future remained distant beyond comprehension. The continents during these ages did not resemble the world we know today. Massive land masses drifted slowly across the planet's surface, carried by tectonic plates moving at the speed of fingernails growing. Continents collided, forming mountain ranges. They separated again, opening new oceans. These movements reshaped climates, redirected currents, and altered ecosystems over and over. Time continued its steady flow. Ice ages came and went. Glaciers advanced across continents, grinding stone into powder beneath their immense weight. They carved valleys, flattened plains, and reshaped coastlines. When they retreated, they left behind fresh landscapes, rich soils, and newly formed rivers. Between these frozen periods, the planet warmed. Forests spread, seas rose, deserts expanded and contracted. These cycles repeated again and again, each one lasting tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years. To the Earth, this was routine. To humans, if they had existed, it would have felt eternal. Plants emerged from water and cautiously moved onto land. Mosses and simple plants clung to damp environments. Over time, more complex plants followed. Roots stabilized soil. Leaves transformed sunlight into energy. Forests rose and fell, shaping the air and climate around them. Animals followed plants onto land, slowly and tentatively. Early creatures crawled across damp ground, then adapted to walk, run, and eventually fly. Life diversified into countless forms. Some grew large and powerful. Others remained small and adaptable. All were shaped by the environments they inhabited. Extinction was a constant presence. Species appeared, thrived, and vanished. Sometimes change came slowly. Other times it arrived suddenly, triggered by volcanic eruptions, shifting climates, or impacts from space. Mass extinctions erased vast portions of life, clearing space for new forms to emerge. The Earth did not remember what it lost. It did not mourn. It continued forward, guided only by natural processes. Each extinction reshaped the planet's future, allowing different possibilities to take root. As millions of years passed, mammals emerged. At first, they were small and unobtrusive, living in the shadows of dominant reptiles. They survived through adaptability rather than strength. When another mass extinction removed those dominant forms, mammals quietly expanded into newly available spaces. Some mammals grew large, others specialized. Many disappeared. A few endured. The planet remained, indifferent to which traits succeeded. It rewarded only what fit the moment. Throughout all of this, the Earth had no awareness of humans. It was not preparing for them. It did not anticipate them. The conditions that would later support human life arose simply because the planet followed its own rhythms. The air grew breathable. The climate stabilized into cycles that allowed long-term survival. Landscapes became varied and complex. Forests, grasslands, mountains, and coastlines formed mosaics of opportunity and challenge. By the time the first human ancestors would eventually appear, the Earth was already ancient beyond comprehension. Every stone carried a memory older than any species alive today. Every mountain had risen and worn itself down before human eyes could ever see it. The world before humans was not empty or incomplete. It was full of movement, adaptation, and quiet balance. Predators hunted, prey fled. Plants grew, bloomed, and died. Oceans pulsed with life. The planet turned steadily beneath the sun, unconcerned with meaning. This deep past reminds us that humanity is a late arrival. We stepped into a story already billions of years in progress. The ground beneath our feet had already traveled across the planet. The air in our lungs had already passed through countless forms of life. As this chapter closes, the Earth remains patient. Life has diversified. Climates continue to shift. Landscapes evolve slowly without instruction or intent. Somewhere in this vast continuum, a small branch of life will soon begin to change in subtle ways. Upright walking will emerge. Hands will become more precise. Awareness will deepen, quietly and without announcement. But for now, the world remains without humans. It turns beneath the sun, steady and ancient, carrying its rhythms forward into the silence. Long before the world held forests, animals, or human footsteps, life began in silence. It did not arrive with intention or awareness. It did not know it was life. It simply happened, slowly and without ceremony, emerging from the steady chemistry of a young planet that had finally learned how to hold itself together. The Earth had already existed for more than 1 billion years before life appeared. Oceans covered much of its surface, absorbing sunlight and heat. The atmosphere was thick and unfamiliar, lacking the oxygen that would later become essential. Lightning cracked through dense skies. Volcanoes released gases from deep within the planet. Energy moved constantly through water, air, and stone. In this restless environment, simple molecules drifted through warm, shallow seas. They collided, separated, and recombined endlessly. Most arrangements led nowhere. They dissolved as quickly as they formed. But over vast stretches of time, some combinations proved more stable than others. They lasted a little longer. They interacted in slightly more complex ways. Eventually, certain molecular systems gained the ability to replicate. Not perfectly, not consistently, but enough to persist. These systems could take in material from their surroundings and use it to create copies of themselves. This was not life as we imagine it, but it was the beginning of something new. The first living organisms were incredibly small, single-celled, fragile. They lived entirely in water, protected from harsh radiation by the depth of the oceans. They did not move with purpose. They drifted, carried by currents responding only to basic chemical signals. There was no thought, no awareness, no intention. Only existence. These early life forms consumed energy in simple ways. Some relied on chemical reactions involving minerals and heat from the Earth's interior. Others eventually learned to use sunlight. This process, photosynthesis, would quietly reshape the planet over millions of years. At first, photosynthesis did not change the world immediately. Oxygen, its byproduct, reacted with surrounding materials and disappeared. Iron dissolved in the oceans, combining with oxygen and sinking to the seafloor. Layer by layer, these reactions left behind bands of mineral deposits that still exist today, silent records of the planet's earliest transformations. As oxygen continued to accumulate, it began to alter the atmosphere itself. This shift took hundreds of millions of years. To any individual organism, nothing would have seemed different. But slowly, the air changed. The sky lightened. A protective ozone layer formed high above the surface, blocking harmful radiation from the sun. This change was both destructive and creative. Many early organisms could not survive in an oxygen-rich environment and disappeared. Others adapted, finding ways to use oxygen to produce energy more efficiently. These adaptations allowed life to become more complex, opening possibilities that had not existed before. Time during this era moved in ways that are difficult to grasp. A single species could exist for tens of millions of years without significant change. Entire ecosystems could rise, stabilize, and fade long before any major transformation occurred. Nothing hurried, nothing paused. Deep time flowed steadily, indifferent to outcomes. Gradually, some single-celled organisms began to cooperate. Cells formed loose colonies, then tighter associations. Eventually, truly multicellular life appeared. These early multicellular organisms were simple, soft-bodied, and often barely distinguishable from their surroundings. They lived in oceans that were still largely empty by modern standards. The first complex life did not resemble animals as we know them today. There were no bones, no shells, no eyes. Bodies were flexible, adapted to gentle movements in water. They absorbed nutrients directly from their surroundings. Their forms were experimental, as if life itself was testing what shapes could endure. Over time, natural selection favored certain traits. Some organisms developed specialized cells. Others formed simple nervous systems, allowing them to respond more quickly to changes in their environment. Predation emerged, introducing new pressures and accelerating evolutionary change. Still, progress was slow. Millions of years passed between major developments. Life expanded cautiously, adapting to available niches. Extinction remained a constant companion. When environments changed, species that could not adapt disappeared quietly, leaving space for others. One of the most significant developments in deep time was the appearance of hard structures. Shells, skeletons, and exoskeletons offered protection and support. They also preserved better in the fossil record, allowing us to glimpse this distant past more clearly. Before this, much of life left little trace behind. With hard structures came greater diversity. Animals grew larger. Movement became more complex. Oceans filled with unfamiliar forms, many unlike anything alive today. Some thrived briefly before vanishing. Others persisted and diversified, shaping future lineages. The land, meanwhile, remained largely barren. Life clung to the edges of water, cautious of the harsh conditions beyond. Without protection from radiation and without stable soils, land was an unforgiving place. But gradually, life began to test it. Simple plants, descended from aquatic ancestors, spread onto damp shorelines. Moss-like organisms anchored themselves to rock and soil, slowly breaking it down. Over time, they created the first thin layers of earth. These early plants altered the atmosphere further, releasing more oxygen and stabilizing the environment. As plant life spread, it transformed the planet. It slowed erosion. It altered weather patterns. It created habitats where none had existed before. The land, once empty, began to support life, in fragile but growing networks. Animals followed plants onto land. Early creatures crawled rather than walked, staying close to water. Over millions of years, limbs adapted. Lungs replaced gills. Eggs developed protective shells. Life moved inland cautiously, adapting step by step. Deep time continued its quiet work. Continents drifted, climates shifted, ice advanced and retreated. Life responded not with intention, but with variation and selection. Traits that fit survived. Others faded. Mass extinctions punctuated this long history. Some were caused by volcanic eruptions that darkened skies and altered climate. Others by changes in sea level or temperature. Each extinction erased countless species, reshaping the trajectory of life. After each loss, life returned. Not to restore what had been, but to create something new. This pattern repeated again and again. Destruction followed by renewal. Silence followed by growth. Throughout these ages, there was no sense of direction. Life did not move toward complexity because it wanted to. It did so because certain conditions allowed it. When conditions changed, complexity sometimes retreated. Simpler forms endured. Survival did not favor progress. It favored balance. The deep past was not a steady climb toward the present. It was a branching, wandering path filled with dead ends and unexpected turns. Many forms of life that once dominated the planet left no descendants. Others survived quietly, unchanged for immense spans of time. This slow unfolding shaped the world that would later give rise to humans. The oxygen-rich air, the layered soils, the stable climates punctuated by change. None of these were designed. They emerged through repetition and patience. By the end of this chapter of Earth's history, life had filled oceans and spread across land. Ecosystems had grown complex. Predators and prey were locked in delicate balance. The planet pulsed with living systems responding continuously to their environment. And still, humans did not exist. No one watched the sun rise or set with awareness. No one named the seasons or marked the passage of years. Life continued without memory, guided only by immediate conditions and deep time's steady flow. This world of first life and deep time laid the foundation for everything that followed. It shaped the planet not through intention, but through endurance. And as this chapter closes, life stands ready to change again. Not because it plans to, but because time will continue to move forward, quietly and without pause. For millions of years after life spread across land and sea, the earth remained without anything that could be called human. Forests grew and vanished. Grasslands expanded and contracted. Animals adapted to countless environments, filling niches shaped by climate, geography, and chance. Among these animals were primates, small social creatures living mostly in trees, relying on grasping hands, sharp vision, and close-knit groups to survive. It was from this long primate story that the first hominins slowly emerged. Not suddenly, not dramatically. There was no single moment when an ape became something else. Instead, there was a gradual drifting away, guided by environment and necessity rather than intention. The earliest hominins appeared in Africa, a continent already ancient and diverse. Africa held forests, open woodlands, river valleys, and expanding grasslands. Over long stretches of time, climates shifted. Forests that once covered large regions slowly gave way to more open landscapes. Trees thinned, grass spread. The world became wider and less sheltered. For primates adapted to life in trees, this change presented new challenges. Moving on the ground exposed them to predators. Food was scattered across larger areas. Travel required longer distances. These pressures did not force a single solution, but they allowed certain traits to become useful in new ways. One of those traits was the ability to stand upright. At first, upright posture was not constant. Early hominins did not walk the way modern humans do. They moved between trees and ground, climbing when possible, walking when necessary. Standing upright may have begun as a temporary behavior, used to reach for food, to wade through shallow water, or to scan the landscape for danger. Over time, however, standing upright became more common. Skeletal changes accumulated slowly. The position of the spine shifted. The pelvis shortened and broadened. The angle of the thigh bone changed, bringing the knees closer together beneath the body. Feet adapted to bear weight more efficiently, developing arches that could absorb shock. These changes did not happen all at once. They unfolded across hundreds of thousands, then millions of years. Many early hominins walked upright imperfectly. Their gait would have looked awkward by modern standards, but even partial upright walking offered advantages. Standing freed the hands. Hands that had once been used primarily for climbing could now carry food, infants, or simple tools. It allowed hominins to transport resources across distances rather than consuming everything where it was found. This simple shift changed how survival worked. Upright posture, also altered how early hominins interacted with their environment. From a higher vantage point, it was easier to see predators approaching across open ground. The body absorbed less direct sunlight during the hottest parts of the day, helping regulate temperature. Walking on two legs required less energy over long distances than moving on all fours, making travel more efficient in expanding landscapes. These advantages did not guarantee survival. Many hominin species appeared and disappeared. The fossil record reveals a branching family tree rather than a straight line. Some lineages thrived for long periods, then vanished. Others persisted quietly, leaving only fragmentary traces behind. Early hominins were not large-brained. Their skulls housed brains only slightly larger than those of modern chimpanzees. Intelligence, as we think of it today, was not yet the defining trait. Survival depended more on physical adaptation, social cooperation, and flexibility than on complex planning. Life for these early hominins was shaped by immediate needs. They foraged for plants, roots, fruits, and seeds. They scavenged meat when possible, taking advantage of carcasses left behind by larger predators. Hunting, if it occurred at all, was limited and opportunistic. Their days followed natural rhythms. They moved with the light. They rested when darkness came. Shelter was temporary and simple: trees, rocky overhangs, or shallow depressions offering minimal protection from weather and animals. There were no permanent homes, no built structures. Everything was provisional. Social life mattered deeply, even at this early stage. Group living offered protection and shared knowledge. Infants required long periods of care, encouraging cooperation among adults. Bonds formed not through words, but through proximity, touch, and repeated interaction. Communication existed, but not as language. Gestures, vocalizations, facial expressions, and shared routines conveyed meaning. Alarm calls warned of danger. Sounds soothed infants. Repetition taught younger members of the group where to find food and how to move through the landscape. Standing upright influenced these social dynamics as well. Faces became more visible. Eye contact became easier. Hands could gesture more freely. Subtle forms of communication gained importance, laying foundations that would later support more complex interaction. The environments early hominins inhabited were not stable. Climate shifted repeatedly. Periods of relative warmth alternated with cooler, drier phases. Grasslands expanded, then retreated. Water sources changed location. These fluctuations rewarded adaptability rather than specialization. Those hominins that could exploit multiple food sources survived more easily than those dependent on a single environment. This flexibility became one of the defining traits of the hominin line. Instead of evolving to fit one narrow niche, early hominins remained generalists, capable of adjusting their behavior as conditions changed. Over time, tool use began to appear. At first, tools were simple and opportunistic. A sharp stone picked up and used, then discarded. A stick used to probe or strike. These were not crafted objects, but extensions of the body. Temporary, solutions to immediate problems. The use of tools did not require advanced planning. It required recognition that an object could serve a purpose beyond itself. This recognition grew slowly, reinforced by repetition and success. Tools became part of daily life without becoming central to identity. Standing upright made tool use more practical. Hands were available, arms were free. Objects could be carried from place to place. This reinforced the advantage of bipedal movement, deepening its role in survival. As generations passed, upright walking became more refined in some hominin groups. Skeletal changes accumulated through inheritance. Children born with slightly better balance or endurance had small advantages. Over long stretches of time, these advantages shaped entire populations. Still, it is important to remember that early hominins were not marching toward humanity. They were responding to their present circumstances. They had no awareness of future possibilities. Their lives were complete in themselves, filled with effort, rest, connection, and loss. Predation remained a constant threat. Large cats, birds of prey, and other carnivores hunted hominins as readily as any other animal. Survival required vigilance. Groups learned to watch the landscape, to stay close together, to retreat when necessary. Death was common. Infancy was fragile. Injury could be fatal. There was no medicine, no long-term care beyond what the group could offer. Yet life continued, generation after generation, sustained by reproduction and shared effort. Over time, hominin diversity increased. Different species occupied different regions, each shaped by local conditions. Some remained more arboreal, spending significant time in trees. Others committed more fully to life on the ground. These variations reflected the flexibility of the hominin experiment. The act of standing upright, so ordinary to us now, was once an uncertain adaptation. It reshaped bodies slowly and unevenly. It came with trade-offs. Upright walking placed stress on the spine and joints. Childbirth became more difficult as pelvic structures changed. These challenges did not stop the process, but they shaped it. Despite these costs, upright posture endured. It became one of the most consistent traits across hominin species. It allowed hominins to occupy environments that other primates could not. It supported travel across open landscapes and laid a groundwork for future developments. As the chapter of early hominins unfolds, we see no clear beginning and no clear destination. We see bodies adjusting to terrain. We see behaviors shifting in response to climate. We see lives shaped by necessity rather than ambition. Standing upright did not make early hominins superior. It made them different. It opened possibilities while closing others. It set the stage for changes that would come much later, but it did not promise them. The earth continued to change around these small populations. Rivers shifted course. Grasslands spread beneath wide skies. Forests contracted into refuges. Early hominins moved within these landscapes, following food, water, and safety as best they could. As this chapter draws to a close, early hominins remain fully embedded in the natural world. They do not control it. They adapt to it. Their lives are shaped by sunlight, rainfall, and the movement of animals. They stand upright, imperfectly but persistently, unaware that this simple posture will one day define an entire species. For now, it is simply a way to move, to carry, to see a little farther across the land. The story continues quietly, step by step, across deep time. For countless generations, early hominins lived much as their ancestors had. They moved through familiar landscapes, followed seasonal rhythms, and relied on bodies shaped by slow adaptation. Upright walking had freed the hands, but for a long time, those hands grasped little more than food, branches, and one another. Then, gradually and without ceremony, something new entered daily life. Not a sudden invention, but a quiet habit, the use of stone. Stone tools did not arrive as finished designs. There were no plans, no instructions passed down in words. Instead, early hominins encountered stones that broke in useful ways. A sharp edge created by chance. A flake produced when one rock struck another. At first, these objects were likely noticed only in passing, but over time, repetition taught recognition. A sharp edge could cut skin more easily. It could scrape meat from bone. It could open tough plant fibers. These small advantages mattered. They saved energy. They reduced time, spent chewing or tearing. They made survival slightly more reliable in an uncertain world. The earliest stone tools were simple. A single rock struck against another to create a sharp edge, used briefly, discarded without ceremony. There was no sense of ownership. Tools belonged to moments, not individuals. When they broke or dulled, they were left behind. Over hundreds of thousands of years, these habits became more deliberate. Certain stones were chosen over others. Shapes became more consistent. Early toolmakers learned through practice, not instruction. Hands remembered what worked. The body repeated movements that produced useful results. This process did not require advanced thought. It required patience and observation. The same qualities that had allowed hominins to survive changing environments now shaped their interaction with materials. Stone became an extension of the body, amplifying the strength and precision of hands. Different types of tools emerged slowly. Cutting tools, scraping tools, heavy stones used for pounding. Each served a purpose tied directly to daily survival. None were decorative, none symbolic. Every tool existed because it solved a problem. Stone tools changed how food was processed. Meat could be accessed more easily. Bones could be broken to reach marrow, a rich source of calories. Plants could be cut and prepared more efficiently. These changes altered diets and, over time, bodies themselves. Better access to calories supported longer development periods for infants. Brains, which require significant energy, could slowly grow larger over generations. This was not a sudden expansion, but a gradual shift supported by improved nutrition. Tool use also encouraged cooperation. Sharing food became more practical when processing was easier. Group members could contribute different skills. Some gathered, some processed, some watched for danger. These roles were fluid, shifting with circumstance rather than fixed by rule. The presence of tools changed how early hominins interacted with animals. They were not yet effective hunters in the modern sense, but they could scavenge more successfully. Sharp edges allowed them to access carcasses left behind by predators. Timing and awareness became critical. Groups learned when to approach and when to retreat. This new relationship with the animal world carried risks. Competition with predators was dangerous. Stone tools did not make hominins dominant. They made them slightly more capable, slightly more adaptable. Survival remained uncertain. As tool use became more common, it left traces behind. Stone survives time better than flesh or wood. These traces allow us to glimpse moments of decision made hundreds of thousands, even millions of years ago. A struck stone, a patterned flake, evidence of repeated behavior. But tools alone did not reshape hominin life as profoundly as the next quiet force to enter their world. Fire. Fire existed long before hominins learned to use it. Lightning ignited dry grasslands. Volcanoes released heat and flame. Wildfires swept across landscapes, destructive and renewing in equal measure. Early hominins would have seen fire from a distance, glowing against the night sky. They would have felt its heat without understanding it. At first, fire was something to avoid. It destroyed familiar places. It frightened animals. It altered the land. But fire also revealed possibilities. Burned areas attracted grazing animals to new growth. Charred remains exposed edible foods. Warmth lingered where flames had passed. Eventually, hominins learned not to fear fire completely. They approached it cautiously. They learned to take advantage of what it left behind. Then, slowly, they learned to keep it. The control of fire did not begin with ignition. It began with preservation, carrying embers, feeding flames with fuel, protecting fire from wind and rain. These acts required attention and cooperation. Fire could not be ignored once acquired. It demanded care. Once fire became part of daily life, everything changed. Nights grew safer. Darkness, once filled with unseen danger, could be pushed back by light. Predators hesitated at the edge of flame. Groups could rest more securely. Fire provided warmth. In cooler climates and colder seasons, it extended the range hominins could inhabit. Shelters became more effective when paired with heat. Survival through cold nights became more reliable. Fire transformed food. Cooking softened tough fibers. It made meat easier to chew and digest. It reduced the risk of illness from parasites. Cooked food yielded more energy with less effort. Over generations, this influenced jaw structure, teeth size, and digestive systems. The act of cooking also changed social life. Food preparation became a shared activity. Groups gathered around flames, waiting, watching, tending. Time slowed. Interaction increased. Sounds, gestures, and routines repeated evening after evening. Firelight altered perception. Faces were illuminated. Expressions became visible after sunset. Communication deepened in subtle ways. The night, once a time of vulnerability, became a space for connection. Fire also reshaped landscapes. Controlled burns could clear areas. They influenced plant growth and animal movement. Though early hominins did not plan these effects, they learned from them. Fire became a tool that interacted with the environment on a larger scale. The combination of stone tools and fire marked a turning point, not because it led directly to civilization, but because it expanded what was possible. Hominins could survive in more places. They could extract more resources. They could adapt more readily to change. Still, life remained precarious. Tools broke. Fires went out. Skills had to be maintained through practice. Knowledge was not stored in writing, but in bodies and habits. When a group lost experienced members, knowledge could be lost with them. Teaching occurred through demonstration rather than explanation. Younger individuals watched. They imitated. They practiced. Mistakes were common. Learning took time. There was no sense of progress as we understand it. Stone tools did not constantly improve. Fire use did not spread evenly. Some groups adopted these practices earlier, others later. Some may have lost them and relearned them again. This uneven pattern reflects the reality of deep time. Change did not sweep across the world uniformly. It moved in pockets, guided by environment and chance. Stone tools became more refined in some lineages. Shapes grew more symmetrical. Techniques became more consistent. These developments suggest increasing skill and memory, but not necessarily conscious planning for the future. Fire remained unpredictable. It could be lost during heavy rain or strong winds. Maintaining it required constant attention. This encouraged routine. Someone had to watch the flame. Someone had to gather fuel. These tasks reinforced cooperation and shared responsibility. The presence of fire also influenced movement. Groups might return to familiar places where fire had been successfully maintained before. Campsites gained significance, not as permanent homes, but as remembered locations. Stone tools and fire together changed the pace of life. Tasks that once consumed entire days could be completed more efficiently. This created moments of relative rest. In these moments, social bonds strengthened, observation deepened, awareness grew. Yet it is important to remember that these developments did not make early hominins modern. They remained vulnerable animals within larger ecosystems. They responded to change rather than directing it. Their lives were shaped by immediate needs rather than long-term plans. As generations passed, the habits of tool use and fire control became woven into daily existence. Children grew up seeing stones shaped and flames tended. These practices became normal, expected, and unremarkable. The earth continued to change around them. Climates shifted. Landscapes evolved. Hominins followed food and water, carrying their skills with them where possible. Stone tools and fire did not separate hominins from nature. They bound them to it in new ways. Tools depended on available materials. Fire depended on fuel and weather. Survival still required close attention to the environment. As this chapter comes to a close, early hominins stand at the edge of a long transformation. Their hands shape stone. Their nights glow with firelight. Their lives are still simple, still fragile, but subtly altered. They do not know they are changing the course of their lineage. They are simply doing what works, repeating what helps them endure. The story continues, shaped by habit, necessity, and the quiet persistence of time. For most of human existence, life followed a pattern shaped not by walls, fields, or permanent homes, but by movement. Long before villages formed or crops were planted, human beings lived as hunter-gatherers. This way of life was not a brief phase or a simple beginning. It was the longest, most enduring mode of human living, stretching across tens of thousands of generations. Hunter-gatherer life unfolded slowly, guided by the rhythms of land, weather, and animal movement. There were no calendars and no written plans. Time was measured in light and darkness, in seasons of growth and scarcity, in the return of animals to familiar paths. Each day carried familiar tasks, repeated so often that they required little explanation. Groups were small, usually made up of extended families and close companions. Living in smaller numbers made movement easier and reduced strain on local resources. These groups did not think of themselves as isolated units. They existed within broader networks, occasionally meeting other groups to exchange mates, tools, stories, and shared knowledge. Movement was central to survival. Hunter-gatherers did not wander aimlessly. They followed known routes shaped by memory and experience. Certain valleys offered water even during dry seasons. Certain forests produced fruit at predictable times. Certain migration paths brought animals close enough to observe, follow, and sometimes hunt. Knowledge of the land was deep and precise. It was learned slowly, passed down through observation rather than instruction. Children grew up watching adults move through the environment with quiet confidence. They learned which plants were safe to eat and which were not. They learned how to read the tracks in soil and broken grass. They learned where to wait and where to move on. Gathering provided a steady foundation of food. Plants, roots, seeds, nuts, and fruits were collected daily. This work required patience and familiarity rather than speed. It often took place close to camp, allowing children and older group members to participate. Gathering was reliable, predictable, and central to survival. Hunting was less frequent, but carried great importance. It required cooperation, planning, and awareness. Early hunting was not the dramatic pursuit often imagined. It involved tracking, waiting, and persistence. Animals were followed over long distances, sometimes for days. Success depended as much on endurance as on strength. Tools played a role, but hunting remained risky. Injuries were common. Failure was expected. Many hunts ended without success. Because of this uncertainty, hunter-gatherer groups relied on diversity rather than specialization. No single food source was trusted completely. Food, once acquired, was shared. Sharing was not an act of generosity as we define it today, but a necessity. Storage was limited. Carrying excess food was impractical. Sharing reduced risk, ensuring that no individual or family faced starvation alone. This practice strengthened social bonds and reinforced cooperation. Meals were communal. Food was prepared and eaten together when possible. Firelight gathered the group at the end of the day. Eating was not rushed. It marked a pause in movement, a moment of rest and connection. Shelter was temporary. Camps were set up where resources were available and abandoned when conditions changed. Shelters might consist of simple windbreaks, branches leaned together, or natural features like rock overhangs. Nothing was meant to last beyond the immediate need. Possessions were minimal. Everything had to be carried. Tools were few and versatile. Clothing was functional, made from animal skins and plant fibers. Objects that broke or wore out were replaced when possible or left behind. Ownership, as later societies would define it, did not dominate daily life. This lightness allowed flexibility. When drought arrived or animals moved on, hunter-gatherers could follow. When climates shifted, routes changed. Adaptation was constant and expected. Social life revolved around cooperation. No individual could survive alone for long. Children depended on adults for many years. Injured members relied on group support. Elders, though less physically capable, carried knowledge that benefited everyone. Communication was rich, even without writing. Stories were told orally, often repeated across generations. These stories preserved information about the land, animals, and past events. They also carried meaning, reinforcing values and shared identity. Language allowed hunter-gatherers to coordinate movement, plan activities, and resolve conflict. But it also provided comfort. Voices around a fire reduced fear in darkness. Shared laughter eased tension. Silence, too, played a role, especially during hunting or travel. Daily life followed a gentle rhythm. Mornings often began with movement, checking traps, gathering food, scouting the area. Midday brought rest during the heat. Evenings gathered the group together again. Sleep followed darkness, shaped by firelight and the sounds of the surrounding world. Hunter-gatherers lived closely with uncertainty. Weather could change suddenly. Injuries could become fatal. Children did not always survive to adulthood. Loss was a familiar presence. Yet life was not defined by constant fear. Familiar routines provided stability. Community offered resilience. Beliefs and rituals emerged naturally from this way of life. Hunter-gatherers often viewed the world as alive and responsive. Animals, plants, rivers, and stones were not separate from human existence. They were part of a shared environment that demanded respect and attention. Rituals marked transitions: birth, death, coming of age. Burial practices suggest care for the dead, indicating emotional depth and memory. Objects were sometimes placed with bodies, not as symbols of wealth, but as gestures of connection. Art appeared in simple forms. Body markings. Carved objects and cave paintings reflected observation and imagination. These were not decorations for display. They were expressions of experience, belief, and memory. Hunter-gatherer societies were not uniform. Life differed between regions and climates. Coastal groups relied heavily on fishing and shellfish. Inland groups followed herds across plains. Forest-dwelling groups focused on plant foods and smaller animals. Each environment shaped behavior in specific ways. Despite these differences, common patterns existed: mobility, sharing, deep environmental knowledge, strong social bonds. These traits allowed hunter-gatherers to survive across nearly every landscape on Earth. Time was experienced differently. Without written schedules or long-term accumulation, attention focused on the present. The past lived through memory and story. The future was anticipated through seasons rather than distant plans. This focus did not limit intelligence or creativity. On the contrary, it demanded constant awareness. Hunter-gatherers read subtle signs in weather, animal behavior, and plant growth. They adjusted quickly when conditions changed. Children learned through participation rather than instruction. They accompanied adults, observing and imitating. Play mimicked adult tasks. Mistakes were part of learning. There was no formal schooling, yet knowledge transfer was effective and enduring. Conflict occurred, but mechanisms existed to reduce its impact. Small group size limited prolonged violence. Disputes were often resolved through separation rather than confrontation. Movement provided an escape from tension. Leadership was fluid. Individuals gained influence through experience, skill, or wisdom rather than authority. Decisions were often made collectively or through consensus. No one ruled permanently. This way of life persisted for tens of thousands of years with remarkable stability. Hunter-gatherers survived ice ages, climate shifts, and environmental change. They adapted repeatedly without transforming their fundamental social structure. The absence of permanent settlements did not mean the absence of belonging. Belonging was tied to people and places remembered through movement. Landscapes were not owned, but known. Paths were not controlled, but shared. Health in hunter-gatherer societies varied. While injuries and infections were dangerous, diets were diverse and physical activity constant. Evidence suggests many hunter-gatherers were physically resilient, though life expectancy remained uncertain. As populations slowly grew and environments changed, pressures increased. Some groups began to spend longer periods in the same areas. Familiar camps became seasonal anchors. Wild plants were tended unintentionally through repeated gathering. These subtle shifts did not immediately end the hunter-gatherer way of life. For many, it continued alongside emerging practices. Change was gradual, uneven, and often reversible. It is important to understand hunter-gatherer life, not as a primitive stage to be overcome, but as a complete and adaptive way of living. It sustained humanity longer than any other system. It shaped bodies, minds, and social bonds. Hunter-gatherers were not waiting for civilization. They were living fully within their world, responding to its demands with patience and skill. As this chapter draws to a close, we see human beings deeply embedded in nature. moving lightly across the land, sharing what they find, gathering at night around firelight, sleeping beneath open skies. This is humanity as it existed for most of its story. Not settled, not written, not ruled, but resilient, connected, and alive within the slow rhythm of the earth. Across the long span of human prehistory, the earth did not remain gentle or predictable. It shifted repeatedly between warmth and cold, abundance and scarcity. Among the most powerful forces shaping early human life were the ice ages, vast climatic cycles that transformed landscapes, altered ecosystems, and tested the limits of survival again and again. An ice age was not a single, continuous winter. It was a rhythm, repeating over tens of thousands of years. Long periods of colder temperatures allowed ice sheets to grow across continents. Shorter, warmer intervals followed, causing those ice sheets to retreat. These cycles unfolded slowly, far beyond the scale of a human lifetime, yet their effects touched every generation that lived through them. As global temperatures cooled, snow that fell during winter did not fully melt during summer. Year after year, it accumulated. Over time, immense glaciers formed, spreading outward from polar regions and high mountain ranges. In some places, ice grew more than a mile thick. Entire landscapes disappeared beneath frozen weight. The presence of ice reshaped the planet. Sea levels dropped as water became locked within glaciers. Coastlines shifted outward, exposing vast stretches of land that had once been submerged. Rivers changed course. New land bridges formed, connecting regions that are now separated by oceans. For early humans and their ancestors, these changes were neither abstract nor distant. They altered daily life in fundamental ways. Familiar routes vanished beneath ice. Forests retreated. Grasslands expanded in some regions and disappeared in others. Animals migrated or adapted, and humans were forced to respond. Survival during the ice ages required flexibility above all else. Groups that depended too heavily on one food source struggled when environments changed. Those that could shift their diets, adjust their movement patterns, and learn from experience endured. Cold itself was a constant challenge. Lower temperatures increased the body's energy needs. Staying warm became a daily priority. Fire, once a useful tool, became essential. Without it, survival through long winters would have been nearly impossible. Shelter grew more important. Temporary camps were positioned carefully to block wind and retain heat. Natural features such as caves, rock overhangs, and dense vegetation were used whenever possible. In open landscapes, early humans constructed simple structures from wood, bone, and hides, creating barriers against cold air and snow. Clothing evolved slowly but meaningfully. Animal skins were prepared and shaped to cover the body more effectively. Wrapping, layering, and fastening improved warmth and mobility. These garments were not decorative. They were practical responses to environment, refined through repetition and experience. Food scarcity was a recurring concern. During colder periods, plant growth slowed or ceased altogether. Gathering became more difficult. In response, hunting grew more central to survival in many regions. Large animals adapted to cold climates, such as mammoths, bison, and reindeer, became vital sources of food, clothing, and materials. Hunting these animals required cooperation and planning. No single individual could bring down such prey alone. Groups learned to work together, using terrain, persistence, and shared effort. Hunts were dangerous and uncertain, but success could sustain a group for extended periods. Nothing was wasted. Meat provided calories. Fat offered warmth and energy. Bones became tools. Hides became clothing and shelter. Survival depended on using every part of what was taken. Ice Age environments also demanded knowledge of seasonal movement. Animals followed predictable routes based on climate and vegetation. Early humans learned these patterns and adjusted their own movements accordingly. Migration was not aimless wandering. It was informed by memory, observation, and shared understanding passed down through generations. Children learned early how to survive in cold environments. They observed adults preparing hides, maintaining fire, and navigating frozen terrain. Learning was constant and practical, embedded in daily tasks rather than formal instruction. Despite the harshness of Ice Age conditions, life did not become a constant struggle without moments of calm. Groups developed routines that brought stability. Camps were organized efficiently. Tasks were divided naturally based on ability and circumstance. Social bonds deepened through shared hardship. Firelight played a powerful role during long, dark winters. Nights stretched on. The world beyond the circle of light was cold and uncertain. Within that circle, warmth, food, and human presence offered comfort. Stories, gestures, and shared silence helped pass the time and strengthen connection. Ice Ages also shaped human movement across the globe. Lower sea levels exposed land bridges that allowed gradual migration into new regions. These movements did not happen all at once. They unfolded slowly over many generations, as groups followed familiar resources into unfamiliar lands. In colder regions, ice itself became part of the landscape humans learned to read. Frozen rivers served as pathways. Snow-covered ground preserved tracks. Subtle changes in wind or temperature signaled shifts in weather. Awareness of these signs could mean the difference between safety and danger. Not all regions experienced ice ages in the same way. Some areas became colder and drier. Others remained relatively mild but unstable. This variation meant that survival strategies differed widely. Coastal groups relied on marine resources. Inland groups focused on large game. Forest edge groups balanced hunting with limited gathering. Extinction was a constant presence during these times. Some animals could not adapt to rapid climate change and disappeared. Others evolved new traits or shifted their ranges. Humans, too, faced constant risk. Groups that failed to adapt left no descendants. Yet survival through repeated ice ages demonstrates remarkable resilience. Early humans were not physically dominant animals. They lacked natural weapons or heavy fur. What allowed them to endure was adaptability, behavioral rather than biological. They changed where they lived. They changed what they ate. They changed how they used tools and fire. These adjustments did not happen through conscious planning for the future, but through repeated responses to immediate conditions. Over thousands of years, these responses accumulated into traditions. Certain hunting methods became customary. Certain shelter designs were repeated. Certain seasonal movements became ingrained. Culture, though unwritten, grew increasingly important. Burial practices during Ice Age periods suggest care for the dead even in difficult conditions. Graves were prepared deliberately. Bodies were sometimes positioned or accompanied by objects. These acts required time and energy, resources that were scarce. Their presence suggests emotional depth and social connection that persisted despite hardship. Art also appeared during Ice Age environments. Cave paintings, carvings, and markings reflect observation and imagination. These works were created in protected spaces, often deep underground. They required planning, materials, and time. Their existence reveals that even in harsh climates, humans found space for expression beyond survival. Ice ages did not progress steadily toward warmth. They fluctuated. Cold periods intensified, then eased. Glaciers advanced, then retreated. Each transition brought new challenges. Melting ice caused floods. Changing vegetation altered animal behavior. Adaptation remained constant. When warmer intervals arrived, they did not erase the lessons of cold periods. Knowledge gained during hardship remained useful. Tools, clothing techniques, and social structures developed during ice ages continued to shape life even as climates improved. The repeated experience of survival through extreme conditions strengthened group cohesion. Trust mattered. Dependence on one another was unavoidable. Isolation was dangerous. Cooperation was not optional. This deep history challenges the idea that early human life was simple or static. Ice Age survival demanded awareness, memory, and flexibility. It required attention to subtle environmental cues and the ability to respond quickly to change. Throughout these long cycles, humans remained part of the natural world rather than separate from it. They did not control climate or landscapes. They adapted to them, learning to live within their limits. As ice ages came and went, human populations slowly expanded into new regions. Each expansion carried risk. Each success depended on the careful balance between knowledge and uncertainty. The legacy of ice ages is written into human history, even if not consciously remembered. Our capacity to endure cold, to cooperate under stress, and to adapt behaviorally rather than physically has deep roots in these frozen chapters of the past. As this chapter closes, we see early humans moving through a world shaped by ice and time. They follow herds across windswept plains. They gather around firelight as snow falls beyond the shelter. They sleep, wake, and move again, guided by seasons older than memory. Ice ages do not define human life, but they shape it profoundly. Survival during these long winters of the world did not come from strength alone, but from patience, cooperation, and the quiet ability to change when change was required. The story continues, carried forward across melting ice and returning warmth, as humanity adapts once more to a shifting Earth. For most of prehistory, movement was not a choice weighed against staying. Movement was life itself. Long before borders, before maps, before any idea of ownership tied people to a single place, humans moved across the earth in slow, patient rhythms. This movement was not a single journey or a dramatic departure. It was a gradual spreading, unfolding across tens of thousands of years, guided by land, climate, animals, and memory. Migration did not begin with an intention to explore the world. Early humans did not stand at the edge of a homeland and decide to leave it behind. Instead, migration happened one step at a time. A familiar path extended slightly farther. A seasonal route shifted. A camp remained in use a little longer than before. Children were born in places their grandparents had only visited briefly. Over generations, these small changes accumulated into vast distances traveled. Africa remained the earliest and longest homeland of humanity. For hundreds of thousands of years, human populations lived and adapted within its varied environments. Forests, savannas, deserts, coastlines, and river valleys provided different challenges and opportunities. This diversity encouraged flexibility, preparing humans for life beyond the continent long before they ever left it. Climate played a powerful role in shaping movement. Periods of warming and cooling altered rainfall patterns, vegetation, and animal behavior. When environments became drier, water sources shifted. When grasslands expanded, grazing animals followed. Humans moved with them, guided not by curiosity, but by necessity. Leaving Africa was not a single event. It occurred multiple times, likely involving different groups at different moments. Some movements may have ended quickly, with groups returning or disappearing. Others continued slowly, following familiar environments into unfamiliar territory. As humans moved north and east, they encountered new landscapes. Forests grew denser. Winters became colder. Daylight changed with latitude. These environments demanded new responses. Clothing became more important. Shelter techniques adapted. Fire use grew more central. Migration followed natural corridors. River valleys offered water and food. Coastlines provided reliable resources and easier travel. Open plains allowed visibility and movement. Mountain ranges and deserts slowed progress, redirecting routes rather than stopping them entirely. One of the most significant features shaping migration was the lowering of sea levels during Ice Age periods. As glaciers expanded, vast amounts of water became locked in ice, causing oceans to recede. Land bridges emerged where seas once flowed. These bridges did not appear suddenly or disappear overnight. They existed for thousands of years, long enough for gradual movement across them. Humans did not perceive these land bridges as crossings between continents. They were simply extensions of familiar land. Animals moved across them. Humans followed. Generation by generation, people found themselves living in regions their ancestors had never known. Movement into Eurasia exposed humans to new animal species and unfamiliar ecosystems. Some animals were larger and more dangerous. Others behaved differently from those in Africa. Learning these patterns took time. Mistakes were costly. Knowledge accumulated slowly through experience and shared memory. As populations spread, they adapted locally. Physical traits changed subtly in response to climate. Skin pigmentation varied with sunlight exposure. Body proportions adjusted to conserve or release heat. These changes unfolded gradually, without awareness, shaped by survival rather than identity. Cultural practices also diversified. Tool styles differed between regions. Hunting strategies adapted to available prey. Shelter designs reflected local materials and weather. Despite these differences, core human traits remained consistent: cooperation, communication, and adaptability. Migration was rarely continuous. Groups paused when conditions were favorable. Rich environments allowed longer stays. Seasonal abundance anchored movement patterns. Over time, these pauses grew longer in some regions, though full settlement remained rare. The spread into colder northern regions tested human resilience. Winters were long. Food scarcity was common. Survival required careful planning and cooperation. Groups that succeeded passed on knowledge of seasonal timing, animal behavior, and environmental signs. Not all migrations were successful. Some groups encountered environments they could not adapt to quickly enough. They left no descendants. These silent endings are part of the migration story, even if they leave little trace. Movement eastward eventually brought humans to the edges of vast continents. In Southeast Asia, changing sea levels created networks of islands and shallow waters. Crossing these regions required patience and awareness. Even short water crossings posed risk. Yet humans moved onward, island by island, over long stretches of time. The movement into Australia stands as one of the earliest major sea crossings. Though distances may have been shorter than today due to lower sea levels, open water still had to be crossed. This suggests careful observation, planning, and perhaps simple watercraft. The journey was not a single voyage, but a series of gradual expansions. Australia presented entirely new challenges. Its animals, climate, and landscapes differed dramatically from those elsewhere. Humans adapted once again, learning to survive in environments unlike any they had known before. Migration across northern regions eventually brought humans into contact with the vast ice-covered landscapes of the far north. During the colder periods, ice sheets dominated much of the land. But along their edges, rich ecosystems supported large animals. Humans followed these animals cautiously. One of the most important migration routes emerged across what is now the Bering Strait. During Ice Age periods, lowered sea levels exposed a wide land bridge connecting Asia and North America. This region was not a narrow crossing, but a broad landscape supporting plants and animals. Humans entered this region gradually, likely living there for generations before moving farther. The journey into the Americas did not happen all at once. Ice sheets blocked easy passage southward for long periods. Movement waited for openings, corridors of land free from ice. When routes opened, humans followed rivers and coastlines southward. Over thousands of years, populations spread across the continents, adapting to forests, plains, deserts, and mountains. This expansion was one of the last major chapters of global human migration. Throughout these movements, humans remained hunter-gatherers. They did not carry civilization with them. They carried skills, knowledge, and social bonds. Their lives remained shaped by mobility and environmental awareness. Migration also shaped social structure. Groups sometimes split when they grew too large. Younger members formed new groups, moving away gradually rather than abruptly. These separations were not necessarily permanent. Encounters between groups allowed exchange and renewal. Language diversified as populations spread. Dialects formed, sounds shifted. Over time, languages became distinct. Yet the capacity for communication remained universal, binding humanity together even as distance grew. Beliefs and rituals traveled with people. Stories adapted to new landscapes. Animals of spiritual importance changed. The environment shaped meaning as much as survival. Despite increasing distance between populations, humans remained fundamentally similar. They faced the same challenges: finding food, caring for children, surviving weather, coping with loss. Migration did not change these realities. It spread them across the planet. Importantly, migration was not driven by conquest or dominance. Early humans did not displace others through organized force. Where humans encountered other hominin species, interactions were complex and varied. Some encounters involved competition. Others involved coexistence and interbreeding. These interactions left traces in the human lineage, reminding us that migration was not a solitary journey. It unfolded within a broader family of related species, each responding to the same environmental pressures. As humans spread, they altered ecosystems simply by existing within them. Hunting affected animal populations. Fire changed vegetation patterns. These effects were unintentional but real, marking the beginning of humanity's long influence on the planet. Still, this influence remained limited by technology and numbers. Humans adapted to environments more than they reshaped them. Nature remained dominant, setting boundaries that could not be crossed without consequence. Migration did not end once. The world was inhabited. Movement continued within regions. Seasonal routes persisted. Populations shifted as climates changed. Even in places where humans remained for long periods, mobility remained part of life. This long history of movement shaped human psychology. Awareness of surroundings, sensitivity to change, comfort with uncertainty. These traits were not learned once. They were reinforced across generations. As this chapter draws to a close, humanity stands dispersed across the globe. From warm coasts to cold plains, from forests to deserts, humans live within nearly every environment the earth offers. They have not settled into permanence. They remain travelers, even when they stay in one place for a time. Migration across the world was not a single story with a beginning and an end. It was a continuous process, unfolding quietly through deep time. It did not announce itself. It left few clear markers, yet it shaped who we are more deeply than any later invention. Humans did not conquer the world. They learned it, step by step, adapting their lives to its contours. And in doing so, they carried their shared humanity across the surface of the earth, guided by patience, necessity, and the slow rhythm of time. Long before writing fixed words in place, before symbols carried meaning across time and distance, humans learned to share their inner worlds through sound, gesture, image, and ritual. Language, art, and belief did not appear suddenly, nor did they arrive as complete systems. They grew slowly, shaped by need, environment, and the quiet complexity of social life. These developments did not separate humans from nature. They deepened humanity's relationship with it, giving form to experience and memory in a world that offered no permanence. Language began not as speech, but as connection. Early humans communicated long before they spoke in structured sentences. Gestures, facial expressions, body posture, and vocal sounds carried meaning. A raised hand could signal caution. A certain tone could soothe an infant. A repeated sound could draw attention. These forms of communication were practical, immediate, and deeply social. Over time, vocal communication grew more complex. Sounds became associated with specific actions, objects, or situations. Repetition reinforced meaning. Children learned by listening and imitating. Gradually, these sounds formed patterns. Patterns became shared understanding. Language emerged not as an invention, but as a habit refined through use. Spoken language transformed daily life. It allowed coordination during hunting and gathering. It made cooperation more efficient. It allowed knowledge to be passed with greater precision. But perhaps most importantly, it allowed humans to share experiences beyond the immediate moment. With language, memory extended beyond individual experience. Stories could be told about events that had already passed. Lessons could be shared without reenactment. Warnings could be given about dangers not currently present. This ability to communicate across time strengthened group survival. Language also shaped social bonds. Shared words created shared identity. Humor emerged through sound and timing. Comfort could be offered through voice alone. Disputes could be resolved through expression rather than action. Silence, too, gained meaning, signaling respect, attention, or tension. There was no single language in prehistory. As groups spread across regions, speech diversified, sounds shifted, meanings evolved, dialects formed. Over generations, languages became distinct. Yet the capacity for language remained universal, a shared human trait connecting distant populations. Language did not exist only for survival. It carried emotion, curiosity, and imagination. It allowed humans to wonder aloud, to name feelings, to reflect on events beyond immediate necessity. This reflection laid the groundwork for belief. Art emerged alongside language, though not always in visible forms. Early art may have included body decoration, rhythmic movement, or temporary markings made from natural pigments. These expressions were not created for permanence. They existed in moments, tied to events, rituals, or shared experiences. Over time, more enduring forms of art appeared. Cave paintings stand among the most striking examples. Deep within caves, often far from daily living spaces, humans painted animals, patterns, and symbols. These images were created deliberately, with care and repetition. They required preparation, tools, and time. The subjects of these paintings were not random. Animals appeared frequently, often those important to survival. Movement was captured with surprising accuracy. These images suggest close observation and deep familiarity with the natural world. The purpose of cave art remains uncertain, and certainty is neither possible nor necessary. What matters is that humans chose to create images where few would see them. This suggests meaning beyond display. These spaces may have held spiritual significance. The act of creating may have been as important as the finished image. Art was not limited to caves. Carved objects, beads, and markings on tools suggest a desire to shape materials beyond pure function. These objects were small, portable, and often worn close to the body. They may have served as personal symbols, markers of identity, or objects of comfort. Art allowed humans to externalize thought, to place something imagined into the world. This act bridged inner experience and shared reality. It allowed meaning to persist beyond the moment of creation. Belief systems grew from this same impulse. Early humans sought to understand the world they inhabited, not through abstract reasoning, but through relationship. Animals, weather, landscapes, and celestial bodies were not distant forces. They were immediate, powerful, and deeply influential. Belief did not begin as organized religion. It began as interpretation. Why did animals return each season? Why did storms come suddenly? Why did death occur? These questions were not answered through measurement, but through story and ritual. Ritual provided structure. It marked important moments: birth, death, coming of age, successful hunts. These rituals created continuity. They helped groups process change and loss. They reinforced shared values and understanding. Burial practices offer some of the clearest evidence of early belief. Bodies were placed deliberately, sometimes accompanied by objects. This required effort at times when energy was precious. Such actions suggest care, memory, and perhaps belief in something beyond death. These beliefs did not separate humans from the natural world. They placed humans within it. Animals might be seen as kin or teachers. Landscapes might hold memory. The boundary between the living and non-living was less rigid than it is today. Art and belief reinforced one another. Symbols, painted or carved, may have held spiritual significance. Ritual spaces became places of creation. The act of making art could itself be a ritual, connecting the creator to something larger. Language supported these systems by allowing stories to persist. Myths emerged not as falsehoods, but as frameworks for understanding. They explained origins, relationships, and responsibilities. They guided behavior and reinforced social cohesion. Importantly, belief systems varied widely. Each group shaped its understanding based on environment and experience. Coastal groups developed beliefs tied to the sea. Plains groups centered animals of the open land. Forest groups focused on growth and cycles. There was no single worldview. Despite this diversity, common themes appeared: respect for forces beyond human control, recognition of interdependence, awareness of cycles, day and night, seasons, life and death. These themes reflect shared human experience rather than shared doctrine. Language, art, and belief also shaped identity. Individuals understood themselves not only as biological beings, but as members of a group with shared meaning. Names may have emerged. Roles were recognized. Personal history gained significance within communal memory. Children grew up immersed in these systems. They learned language through listening. They learned belief through participation. They learned art through observation and practice. Learning was gradual and integrated into daily life. These developments did not replace practical survival skills. They complemented them. A skilled hunter also knew stories. A gatherer also understood ritual. Knowledge was not divided into categories. It formed a whole. As populations grew and groups interacted, ideas traveled. Stories changed as they moved. Symbols adapted. Beliefs blended. Cultural exchange occurred quietly through shared camps, intermarriage, and cooperation. Conflict existed, but belief systems often helped regulate behavior. Shared values discouraged excessive violence. Rituals resolved tension. Stories reinforced cooperation and caution. Language, art, and belief deepened emotional experience. Grief could be shared. Joy could be celebrated. Fear could be named. These expressions strengthened resilience in uncertain environments. Importantly, these developments did not make humans modern in the way we define it today. They did not lead directly to cities, writing, or formal religion. They enriched life within the hunter-gatherer world rather than replacing it. For tens of thousands of years, humans lived with language spoken but not written, art created but not displayed publicly, belief practiced but not codified. These systems were flexible, responsive, and deeply tied to environment. As time passed, these capacities grew more complex. Vocabulary expanded, artistic techniques refined, beliefs layered with history. But the foundations remained the same: connection, expression, and meaning. As this chapter draws to a close, we see humans not only surviving, but interpreting their world. They speak to one another. They create images that endure. They honor forces they cannot control. In a world without writing, these acts give shape to memory. They allow the human experience to deepen without becoming fixed. They carry meaning forward in voices, images, and shared understanding. Language, art, and belief do not end prehistory. They flourish within it. They remind us that long before civilization, humanity was already rich in thought, expression, and connection, living not only to endure, but to understand. The end of prehistory did not arrive with an announcement. There was no clear moment when one world stopped and another began. No single generation woke to find itself living in a new age. Instead, the end of prehistory unfolded slowly, unevenly, and quietly, shaped by countless small decisions made in response to changing conditions. It was less an ending than a long transition, stretching across thousands of years. For most of human existence, life had been guided by movement. Hunter-gatherer rhythms followed animals, plants, seasons, and weather. This way of life had proven resilient across ice ages, migrations, and environmental change. It did not collapse or fail. It simply began, in some places, to shift. The forces behind this shift were not ideological or planned. They were practical. Climate changes at the end of the last major ice age altered landscapes across the world. Glaciers retreated. Temperatures stabilized in many regions. Rainfall patterns shifted. New environments emerged where ice and cold had once dominated. As climates warmed, certain plants grew more predictably in specific areas. Wild grains, tubers, and other edible plants became more abundant in some regions, returning year after year to the same places. Animals, too, adjusted their ranges, sometimes becoming more localized rather than constantly migrating. For hunter-gatherers living in these environments, movement remained important, but it began to change in character. Groups returned to familiar locations more often. Seasonal camps became more reliable. Certain places offered enough resources to support longer stays. These longer stays did not immediately produce permanent settlements. They produced familiarity. Knowledge deepened. People learned the timing of plant growth with greater precision. They observed how harvesting affected future growth. They noticed that discarded seeds sometimes sprouted near camps. At first, these observations did not lead to intentional farming. They led to subtle behavior changes. People returned to productive areas repeatedly. They cleared small patches of land through walking and fire. They favored certain plants by harvesting others more heavily. These actions were not planned experiments. They were responses shaped by habit. Over generations, these habits altered ecosystems. Plants that responded well to human presence thrived. Those that did not gradually disappeared from frequently visited areas. Humans, without realizing it, became participants in shaping plant life. Animals, too, were affected. Some species adapted to living near human camps, attracted by waste or protection from predators. Others were hunted more intensively. Humans began to understand animal behavior with increasing detail, tracking breeding patterns, movement, and temperament. In some regions, this familiarity led to new relationships with animals. Instead of following herds endlessly, people began to manage access. Young animals were captured and raised. Aggressive individuals were avoided. Over time, certain species became more tolerant of human presence. These processes unfolded slowly and unevenly. In many parts of the world, hunter-gatherer life continued largely unchanged for thousands of years. In others, especially where climates stabilized and resources clustered, new patterns emerged. Gradually, the balance between movement and staying shifted. Camps that once lasted weeks lasted months. Structures became more substantial. Storage pits appeared, allowing food to be saved for later use. With storage came planning, and with planning came new risks. Stored food could spoil. It could attract animals. It could be stolen. Protecting resources required new forms of cooperation and vigilance. The rhythm of daily life began to change. As people stayed longer in one place, populations grew. More children survived. More mouths needed feeding. The flexibility of movement that once relieved pressure became harder to maintain. Staying became necessary not because it was ideal, but because leaving became more difficult. With increased population density came new social challenges. Disputes could not always be resolved by separation. Relationships became more complex. Leadership roles emerged more clearly, though still informally. Influence grew from experience, resource control, or skill rather than force alone. These changes did not occur everywhere at once, nor did they follow the same pattern in every region. In river valleys, predictable flooding created fertile soil that supported repeated planting. In highlands, terraced landscapes emerged slowly. Along coasts, fishing and shellfish collection supported more permanent living. What we now call agriculture did not appear fully formed. It emerged through experimentation, failure, and adaptation. Early cultivation was unreliable. Crops failed. Weather ruined harvests. Dependence on a few food sources increased vulnerability. Many early farming communities likely struggled more than their hunter-gatherer neighbors. Diets narrowed. Disease spread more easily among settled populations. Physical labor increased. These costs were not immediately obvious, but they shaped long-term outcomes. Despite these challenges, settled life offered certain advantages. Storage provided security against short-term scarcity. Proximity allowed stronger communal ties. Knowledge accumulated in specific places rather than moving constantly. Over time, these advantages encouraged further investment in place. Homes became more permanent. Tools specialized. Pottery appeared, allowing better storage and cooking. These developments supported larger populations, reinforcing the shift toward settlement. As settlements grew, so did social differentiation. Some individuals controlled access to resources. Others specialized in tasks beyond food production. Tool-making, ritual leadership, coordination. Inequality, once limited by mobility and sharing, began to appear more clearly. Belief systems adapted to these new conditions. Rituals tied to land, fertility, and cycles of planting emerged. Sacred spaces became fixed rather than temporary. Ancestors were associated with specific places. Memory attached itself to land more strongly than before. Language, too, reflected these changes. Vocabulary expanded to describe ownership, boundaries, seasons of planting, and stored goods. Time began to be measured in cycles of work rather than movement alone. Trade networks expanded. Surpluses allowed exchange over longer distances. Materials traveled between communities. Ideas followed. Interaction increased, bringing both cooperation and conflict. As settlements grew larger and closer together, conflict became more difficult to avoid. Disputes over land, water, and resources intensified. Defensive structures appeared in some areas. The social fabric grew more complex and fragile. It is important to understand that none of these changes were inevitable or universal. Many groups resisted settlement or returned to mobility after experimenting with farming. Others blended practices, maintaining hunting and gathering alongside cultivation. Prehistory did not end everywhere at the same time. In some regions, writing appeared thousands of years before others. In many parts of the world, prehistory continued long after cities rose elsewhere. The defining feature of the end of prehistory is not agriculture or settlement alone. It is the appearance of written records. Writing fixed memory in place. It allowed information to survive beyond spoken tradition. It created history as we recognize it. Writing emerged gradually from accounting, ritual marks, and symbolic notation. Early writing did not record personal stories or emotions. It tracked goods, obligations, and events of importance to emerging institutions. Once writing appeared, change accelerated. Laws could be recorded. Authority could extend beyond direct presence. Memory became externalized. The pace of transformation increased. But this acceleration should not overshadow what came before. The long stretch of prehistory was not a waiting period. It was a complete human experience, rich in knowledge, culture, and adaptation. The end of prehistory did not erase hunter-gatherer life. Many such societies continued, and continue still. Civilization did not replace humanity. It became one expression among many. As this chapter draws to a close, we stand at the threshold rather than a conclusion. Human beings remain shaped by deep time. Bodies adapted to movement now learn to stay. Minds shaped by memory now learn to record. The world grows more crowded. Relationships grow more layered. The simplicity of constant movement fades, replaced by the complexity of permanence. Prehistory does not vanish. It lingers beneath every written word, every settled place, every belief tied to land and ancestry. It lives in the human capacity to adapt, to cooperate, and to respond to change. The story does not end here. It turns, quietly, gradually, carrying the deep past forward into recorded time, where memory becomes history, and silence gives way to names. As this long timeline gently comes to rest, it is worth pausing in the quiet space it leaves behind. Before names were written, before dates were fixed in place, before history learned how to preserve itself, human life unfolded in a different rhythm, a slower one, a rhythm guided not by clocks or records, but by light, weather, memory, and need. For most of our existence, humanity lived without permanence. There were no cities to return to, no walls to define belonging, no written words to anchor events in time. And yet life was full. It was shaped by repetition, familiarity, and deep connection to the world that surrounded it. People knew the land not by maps, but by movement. They knew time not by numbers, but by seasons and cycles that returned again and again. Prehistory reminds us that being human did not begin with civilization. It did not begin with agriculture, writing, or monuments. Long before these things appeared, humans already spoke, already imagined, already cared for one another. They adapted to ice and heat, darkness and distance. They shaped tools, tended fire, shared food, told stories, and buried their dead with intention. These acts were not steps toward a known destination. They were responses to the present moment. Early humans did not live in anticipation of cities or empires. They lived within the limits of their world, adjusting when those limits shifted. Their lives were not incomplete. They were whole, even without records to preserve them. The deep past teaches patience. Change did not arrive suddenly or cleanly. It unfolded through countless small adjustments, made by people who never knew the impact of their choices beyond their own lives. Standing upright, carrying stone, tending fire, returning to familiar ground. These were not revolutions. They were habits that worked, repeated until they became part of being human. When we look back across this immense span of time, it is tempting to see everything as leading toward the present. But prehistory resists that framing. It does not point in one direction. It spreads outward, branching into many possibilities, most of which did not lead to modern societies at all. Many paths ended quietly. Others continued alongside civilization rather than being replaced by it. Even now, echoes of this ancient way of life remain. Our bodies still reflect a past shaped by movement rather than stillness. Our minds remain sensitive to rhythm, pattern, and story. Our need for connection, for shared meaning, for belonging within a group, did not arise with civilization. It was already there, long before the first words were written down. Prehistory also reminds us of humility. Humanity arrived late in the story of the Earth. The planet lived, changed, and adapted for billions of years before human beings ever appeared. The air we breathe, the soil beneath our feet, the cycles of climate and life were shaped without us. We entered an ancient system already in motion, and, yet, within that vastness, human life mattered deeply to those who lived it. Each generation faced uncertainty without knowing the future would ever be recorded. Each group cared for children who would grow into adults with the same fragile hopes and fears. Meaning existed without permanence. Memory lived in voices, gestures, and shared experience. The end of prehistory did not erase this way of being. It layered something new on top of it. Writing allowed memory to extend further, but it also narrowed focus. Settlements created stability, but they reduced movement. Civilization brought complexity, but it also brought distance, from land, from cycles, from one another. When we return to prehistory, even briefly, we are reminded of another pace of life, one that allowed attention to settle, one that followed the earth rather than attempting to reshape it entirely. This does not mean it was easier or better. It was simply different, shaped by constraints that demanded awareness and cooperation. As you rest with this story, there is no need to carry facts forward or remember timelines. Let the sense of deep time do what it does best. Let it quiet urgency. Let it remind you that change does not need to be rushed to be real, that survival does not require constant forward motion, that being human has always included waiting, adapting, and beginning again. The world before civilization was not silent. It was filled with footsteps, voices, and firelight. Those sounds have faded, but their presence remains woven into who we are. We carry prehistory not as memory, but as inheritance. And, as this reflection gently comes to an end, allow the long arc of time to settle. Civilization may mark our records, but humanity's story began long before them. It continues now, shaped still by deep patterns learned in a world without walls or words. For tonight, there is nothing more to follow. The past can rest, and so can you.